February 14th, 2027. That's the date circled in red ink on a confidential memo sitting in the European Central Bank's Crisis Management Office right now. It's not a typo, and it's not a retirement party. It's the projected date when France's debt servicing costs will exceed its entire education budget. When a country that gave the world the Enlightenment will spend more money apologizing for past mistakes than it does preparing its children for the future. But here's what they're not telling you. That date isn't a prediction, it's already baked into the numbers, and the clock started ticking the moment you clicked play. You think France is wealthy. You think it's a land of Louis Vuitton, 5-week vacations, and free healthcare. You see the Eiffel Tower glittering at night, the vineyards of Bordeaux, the Formula One yachts docked in Monaco, and you think you're looking at prosperity. But what you're actually witnessing is the most expensive illusion in Europe, a country that has been writing checks its economy can't cash for 50 consecutive years. A nation where the middle class is being crushed into dust while billionaires hawk handbags to tourists. Where the smartest minds are fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, and where the retirement system is mathematically, provably, undeniably a Ponzi scheme. That would make Bernie Madoff blush. France isn't just poorer than you think. It's a financial time bomb wrapped in cashmere, and the fuse is almost gone. Now I know what you're thinking. France, the country with the world's most valuable luxury conglomerate, the nation that invented champagne and charges you 40 euros for a glass. How could they possibly be broke? Well, because luxury brands don't pay pensions, because LVMH's stock price doesn't fill potholes in rural Normandy. And because while Bernard Arnault became the richest man on earth selling dreams to Chinese tourists, the average French worker saw their purchasing power get squeezed into oblivion. This matters to you, wherever you are right now, because France is the canary in the coal mine for every Western democracy. It is showing you in real time what happens when a rich country runs out of road, when the math stops working. When the bill finally comes due, and if you think this is just a French problem, you're not paying attention. This is coming for all of us. Let me take you inside the machine, because what's killing France isn't some abstract economic theory. It's a specific, brutal mechanism that's been operating in plain sight for decades, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It starts with something economists call smikodization, and it's one of the most insidious forms of economic violence ever inflicted on a middle class. Here's how it works. Picture yourself as a young French professional in 2024. You did everything right. You survived the brutal classes préparatoires, the elite boot camps that break students mentally before they even reach university. You got your master's degree. You speak fluent English. You land what should be a good job in Lyon or Toulouse, a mid-tier city where life should be affordable. You open your first real paycheck, and you see the number, 1,740 euros net per month. That's 20,000 euros a year, in a developed country, for a skilled professional. Now compare that to your friend who didn't go to university, who works part-time stocking shelves at Carrefour. They're on the SMIC, France's minimum wage, which in 2024 sits at about 1,400 euros net per month. Do you see the problem? The gap between minimum wage and middle class is 600 euros. That's the price of dinner for two at a decent Paris restaurant. That's one tank of gas and a gym membership. That's nothing. You spent 5 years studying, you manage a team, you have responsibilities. And you take home barely 40% more than someone with zero qualifications. This isn't just unfair, it's economically homicidal. Because when the reward for skill is that small, ambition dies, innovation dies. The entire country becomes a participation trophy where everyone gets the same mediocre prize. And that prize is barely scraping by. Here's where it gets darker. This isn't an accident. This is the result of a deliberate wage compression that's been happening for 30 years. Every time inflation spikes, the government automatically raises the SMIC to protect the poor. Noble right. Except companies can't afford to raise everyone's salary because French labor costs are grotesque. We'll get to that tax nightmare in a moment, trust me. So the floor rises, but the ceiling stays exactly where it is. Year after year, the bottom creeps up, the middle stays frozen, and eventually the floor eats the room. In the 1990s, only about 8% of French workers were on minimum wage. Today, it's over 17% of the entire workforce, and millions more hover just a few euros above it. France has successfully turned its economy into a pancake, flat, dense, and impossible to rise out of. Now you might be thinking, okay, but at least they have health care, at least rent is cheap, right? Wrong, dead wrong. Let me introduce you to the French real estate Thunderdome. In Paris, a studio apartment, and I mean a box where you can touch the fridge from your bed, where the shower is literally in the kitchen. Costs between 1,200 and 1,500 euros a month, on a median salary of 1740, do the math. That's 85% of your income before you've bought a baguette. You're not living in Paris, you're financially drowning in it. And this isn't just Paris. In Lyon, Bordeaux, even Nantes, rent is consuming 50 to 60% of young workers' salaries. The French dream of home ownership, it's a joke, a cruel, expensive joke. The average age of a first-time homebuyer in France is now 38 years old, 38. By that age, your parents owned a house, had 2 kids, and were planning retirement. You're still splitting a 2-bedroom with a roommate who microwaves fish. But the smikodization isn't just destroying wallets, it's destroying souls. Imagine the psychological toll of working your entire life to climb a ladder, only to realize the ladder is horizontal. You study engineering, you take on stress, you sacrifice your 20s, and you end up earning the same as someone who didn't. Why bother? Why innovate? Why take risks? This is how you turn an entire generation into quiet quitters, people who show up, do the bare minimum, and go home. Because the system has made effort meaningless, and when effort becomes meaningless, economies die. Slowly, quietly, like a patient bleeding out in a waiting room while everyone pretends everything is fine. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, but France still makes stuff right. Airbus high-speed trains, nuclear reactors. Let me stop you right there, because we need to talk about the museum economy. France doesn't make things anymore. It curates the memory of when it used to. Let me show you the numbers, and they're going to hurt. In 1980, manufacturing accounted for about 25% of France's GDP. Today, 10%, 10. France has deindustrialized faster and harder than almost any Western nation, faster than the UK, faster than the US. Even Italy, which everyone mocks as chaotic, has retained more of its industrial base than France. Why? Because for 40 years, French elites decided that factories were dirty, old-fashioned, and beneath them. They wanted France to be a nation of consultants, designers, and luxury brand managers. They wanted to be the Silicon Valley of cheese and handbags, and in a way, they succeeded. France is the #1 tourist destination on Earth. 90 million visitors a year come to gawk at the Louvre, sip overpriced coffee, and Instagram the Notre Dame. But here's the thing about a museum economy. Museums don't create wealth, they extract it from visitors. And when those visitors stop coming, when there's a pandemic or a recession or just a shift in taste, the entire model collapses. You can't build a superpower on waiters and tour guides. When France gutted its factories and sent production to Poland, China, and Vietnam, it didn't just lose jobs. It lost the high-paying blue-collar jobs that sustained the middle class in rural areas. When those jobs disappeared, entire towns died, the bakery closed, the school shrank. The doctor retired and was never replaced. This is the peripheral France, the France that nobody talks about. The France that the Parisian elites fly over on their way to Brussels. And this is the France that exploded in rage with the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement. When you saw them burning toll booths and smashing windows, that wasn't mindless violence. That was the death scream of communities that had been abandoned by the museum economy. And here's the kicker, the part that should terrify every Western nation. During COVID, France realized in a panic that it couldn't even manufacture basic painkillers, paracetamol, aspirin. The country that gave the world Louis Pasteur, the inventor of vaccines, had to beg India and China for Tylenol. That's what happens when you offshore everything. That's what happens when you bet your entire economy on selling the past to tourists. You become dependent, vulnerable, weak. And when the next crisis hits, and it will, France won't have the capacity to respond. It will be at the mercy of supply chains it doesn't control in countries it can't influence. But that was just the warm-up. The real danger is what happens next. Because all of this, the wage compression, the deindustrialization, the crumbling towns, it's all being financed by a debt bomb that nobody wants to talk about. Let's talk about France's national credit card and why it's about to get declined. In 2024, France's public debt hit 113.9% of GDP. That's 3.3 trillion euros. Trillion. To put that in perspective, the European Union has rules, the famous Maastricht criteria, that say member states should keep their debt under 60% of GDP. France is at 114. France hasn't seen 60% debt since the early 1990s. Back when the internet was still a military project and people thought the Macarena was good. But here's the truly insane part. France has not balanced its budget since 1974, not once. For 50 consecutive years, every single government, left-wing, right-wing, centrist, socialist, Gaullist, it doesn't matter, has spent more money than it collected. Every single year. That's not a political failure, that's a national addiction. And like all addictions, it requires bigger and bigger doses to maintain the high. Where does the money go? It's not going into infrastructure. French bridges are crumbling. It's not going into the military. France spends 1.9% of GDP on defense, barely meeting NATO's minimum. It's going into social protection. France spends a staggering 32 to 34% of its GDP on social spending. That is the highest in the world, higher than Sweden, higher than Denmark, higher than any country on earth. It's a welfare state on steroids, a Rolls-Royce social model running on a Peugeot economy. Now, don't get me wrong, it's nice that people don't die in the street from lack of insulin. It's great that students don't graduate with crippling debt. But this level of spending is mathematically unsustainable when your economy is growing at 0.7% a year. You're spending like a tech bro in a bull market while earning like a gig worker in a recession. And the bill is coming due. In 2025, France's interest payments on its debt hit 67 billion euros. That's 2.5% of GDP, just the interest, not paying down the debt, just servicing it. And those interest payments are projected to hit 3% of GDP by 2029, potentially 4% by 2030. Soon, France will spend more money paying interest to bondholders than it spends on its entire education system. Think about that. France will spend more money on past mistakes than on future generations. If that doesn't scream poorer than you think, nothing does. And here's where it gets terrifying. France uses the euro. It can't print money like the US or the UK. It can't devalue its currency to make the debt cheaper. It's locked into a monetary union with Germany. And Germany is not in the mood to bail anyone out. France is entirely dependent on the bond markets. On investors believing that France will eventually, someday, somehow get its house in order. But what happens when they stop believing? What happens when the bond vigilantes, the same people who crushed Greece in 2010, decide that France is next? You get a death spiral, interest rates spike, debt payments explode, the government is forced to cut spending and raise taxes, which crashes the economy, which lowers tax revenue, which increases the deficit, which spikes interest rates even higher. It's a vicious cycle, and France is standing on the edge of it right now. Now I can already hear some of you saying, okay, but at least the French get something for their taxes, right? Free healthcare, great pensions, all that good stuff. Well, let me introduce you to the great salary illusion. And this is where things get truly dystopian. Let's go back to that job offer. A company wants to hire you for a decent mid-level position. They're willing to spend 60,000 euros a year on you. That's the super brute, the total cost to the employer. Sounds good, right? Wrong. First, the government takes a massive bite called employer social contributions. Poof, 16,000 euros gone. Now your gross salary, the number written on your contract, is about 43,000 euros. But wait. You don't get 43,000. Now the government takes employee social contributions for health insurance, unemployment, pensions, all the good stuff. Another huge bite. Roughly 10,000 euros. Now you're left with your net salary, about 33,000 euros. But we're still not done, because now you have to pay income tax on that net salary. Depending on your situation, that's another 4,000 to 6,000 euros. By the time the money actually hits your bank account, the money you can use to buy groceries, pay rent, or God forbid save for the future, you're left with about 28,000 to 30,000 euros. Out of an original 60,000, let me say that again, your employer paid 60,000 euros for your labor. You received 30,000, half of it vanished into the state apparatus. France has the highest tax burden in the OECD. The government confiscates about 45 to 48% of the entire country's GDP in taxes and social charges every single year. This creates a vicious, suffocating cycle. Companies can't afford to pay high net salaries because the taxes on top are astronomical. Employees have no disposable income to spend, so the local economy stagnates. Consumption flatlines. Businesses struggle. The government sees the stagnation and says, we need more revenue to fix this. And raises taxes again. It's an economic boa constrictor. It squeezes slowly, and you don't realize you're suffocating until you try to save money at the end of the month. And realize you can't. You're not building wealth. You're not investing. You're just surviving month to month, paycheck to paycheck, in one of the richest countries on earth. And God help you if you try to get rich. France has a cultural, almost pathological allergy to wealth. For years, France had a wealth tax, the ISF, that taxed you just for having assets, regardless of whether those assets generated income. It was so punitive that it drove an estimated 42,000 millionaires out of the country between 2000 and 2012. 42,000 people who could have invested, created jobs, and paid taxes. Gone. Emmanuel Macron replaced it with a real estate wealth tax, but the message remains crystal clear. Success is suspicious. Ambition is vulgar. If you make money, you better apologize for it by giving us half. This is why there are no French Googles, no French Amazons, no French Teslas. The system is designed to prevent anyone from breaking out. It's economic equality achieved through universal mediocrity. But the valley of death, the point where this entire system collapses, isn't the taxes, it's the pensions. And this is where the French illusion becomes a full-blown nightmare. You probably saw the news in 2023. Paris was burning, garbage piled high in the streets, riot police charging through clouds of tear gas. Millions of people on strike. Why? Was it a war, a coup, an invasion? No, the government proposed raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. 2 years, that's it. To the rest of the world, this looked insane. In Germany, the retirement age is heading to 67. In the UK, it's 66, heading to 67. In the US, it's 67. But in France, asking people to work 2 more years was treated like a human rights violation. Protests lasted for months. Macron had to ram the law through without a vote using a constitutional loophole. And his approval rating collapsed. But here's the dark reality those protesters didn't want to admit. The French pension system is a demographic Ponzi scheme, and it's collapsing in real time. Here's how it works. France uses a pay-as-you-go pension system. That means the money deducted from your paycheck today isn't being saved in an account for your retirement. It's being wired directly to a retiree right now. You are paying for your grandmother's vacation in Nice. This system works beautifully when you have 4 workers for every 1 retiree. That was France in the 1960s. The baby boom, the Trent Gloriouses, the 30 glorious years of post-war growth. But today, France has roughly 1.7 workers for every 1 retiree, and that ratio is dropping. France is getting old. The baby boomers are retiring en masse, and the birth rate is not high enough to replace them. So you have a shrinking pool of young, underpaid workers, remember the smikodization, trying to support a growing army of retirees who are living longer than ever thanks to healthcare. The math is brutal. It simply does not work. The French pension system is bleeding 6.6 billion euros a year right now. And that deficit is projected to hit 15 billion euros annually by 2035. To plug the hole, the government has exactly 2 choices. 1. Cut pensions, political suicide. Touch a French retiree's pension and you'll have a revolution on your hands. 2. Raise the retirement age. Also political suicide, but slightly slower. So the country is stuck in a paralyzed state of denial. The young know they will probably never see a full pension. The system will be bankrupt by the time they retire, yet they're being taxed to death right now to pay for the old. It's an intergenerational robbery happening in broad daylight, and it's making the working population poorer every single day. The French aren't paying into a retirement system. They're paying into a black hole that will give them nothing in return. But that was just the warm-up. The real danger is what happens next, because all of this, the debt, the taxes, the pensions, is creating a mass exodus that nobody wants to talk about. The smartest people in France are leaving, and they're never coming back. If you walk into a Goldman Sachs office in London, a Google campus in Zurich, or a research lab at MIT, look at the name tags. You'll see a shocking number of French names: Dubois, Martin, Laurent, Moreau. France produces brilliant minds. The education system, specifically the elite grandes écoles like Polytechnique, ENS, HEC, is world-class at churning out engineers, mathematicians, and financiers. But France cannot keep them. This is the brain drain, and it is bleeding the country dry of its most valuable resource, human capital. Imagine you're a top-tier software engineer or AI researcher in Paris. You just graduated from Polytechnique, one of the most prestigious schools in Europe. Option A: stay in France, earn €45,000 a year, pay 50% in taxes, struggle to rent a 30-square-meter apartment. Deal with a rigid, hierarchical corporate culture where you wait 15 years for a promotion because the guy above you has tenure and isn't going anywhere. Oh, and by the way, if you want to start your own company and it fails, you're socially dead. Bankruptcy in France is a scarlet letter. Move to California or London or Zurich, earn $150,000 a year, pay 30 to 40% in taxes, live in a house. Lead a team immediately, work in a culture that celebrates risk and rewards ambition, and if your startup fails, no big deal. Try again, it's not a hard choice. Estimates suggest that between 2.5 and 3 million French citizens live abroad. But it's not a random sample. It's not grandma retiring to Portugal. It's the risk-takers, the entrepreneurs, the scientists. The people who could actually fix France are the ones leaving it. When the smartest people leave, innovation leaves with them. This is why there is no French Google, no French Amazon, no French SpaceX. There are very few French tech giants created in the last 20 years. You know why? Because the founders left. They built Snowflake in the US. The CEO is French. They built Datadog in the US. French founders. They built Moderna. The CEO, Stéphane Bancel, is French. France is effectively subsidizing the rest of the world. The French taxpayer pays for the expensive education of these geniuses, and then the US or UK economy reaps the profits of their labor. It's the most expensive talent export program in history, and France gets nothing in return except a participation certificate. This creates a country that feels stagnant, a country where ambition is capped. If you stay, you accept the sailing. If you want to break through, you buy a plane ticket. And that brain drain creates a feedback loop. The smartest leave, innovation slows, the economy stagnates. Taxes go up to cover the deficit, more smart people leave, repeat. France is stuck in a death spiral of its own making, and the ladder that could pull it out is being carried away by immigrés. Boarding flights at Charles de Gaulle. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but at least they still have the social services. At least the free stuff works. Let me tell you something that's going to break your heart. The free stuff is breaking. For decades, the unspoken contract in France was simple. We take half your money, but we give you world-class services in return. Healthcare that works, schools that educate, trains that run on time. That contract is void. Visit a French emergency room today, and you might wait 10, 12, sometimes 20 hours to see a doctor. There are medical deserts in rural France where you cannot find a GP within 50 kilometers. Doctors are retiring, and the numerus clausus, the quota system that artificially limited the number of new doctors for decades, created a shortage. That will take a generation to fix. The French healthcare system, once the envy of the world, is crumbling under its own weight. Look at the education system. French students used to dominate international math and science rankings. In the latest PISA results, France has dropped to the middle of the pack, with inequality skyrocketing. Rich kids in Paris are fine, poor kids in the banlieues, the suburbs, they're being left behind. Teachers are underpaid, demoralized, and leaving the profession in droves. The government is now hiring unqualified staff just to put warm bodies in classrooms. This is the education system that produced Descartes, Pasteur, and Curie. Today, it's barely functional. Look at the justice system. It's notoriously slow and underfunded. Cases take years to resolve. Prisons are overcrowded and falling apart. The infrastructure that once made France the envy of Europe is decaying in real time. The tragedy is that the French are still paying luxury prices in taxes, but they're receiving budget service. When the public sector fails, those with money opt out. They send their kids to private schools. They go to private clinics. They hire private security. This creates a two-tier society. The rich insulate themselves from the decline, while the poor and the middle class are left with crumbling infrastructure and deteriorating services. The égalité carved onto the front of every town hall is starting to look less like a promise and more like a cruel joke. France isn't just poorer than you think. It's becoming unequal in ways that violate its own founding mythology. And when the gap between the myth and the reality becomes too wide, societies don't reform, they explode. And that brings me back to February 14th, 2027, the date I mentioned at the beginning. The date when France's interest payments will exceed its education budget. That date isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it's a symbol. A turning point, the moment when a country stops investing in its future and starts paying for its past. And once you cross that line, once you're spending more on debt than on children, you don't come back. You enter a managed decline, a slow, polite, genteel collapse where everything gets a little worse every year. The trains get a little slower, the hospitals get a little more crowded, the brightest minds leave a little faster. And eventually, you wake up one day and realize you're no longer a wealthy country. You're a poor country with expensive real estate and good marketing. So is France doomed? Is it destined to become an open-air museum where tourists throw coins at the natives? Not necessarily. France has bounced back before. This is a country that survived the 100 Years' War, the Revolution, 2 world wars, and Nazi occupation. There is a resilience in the French character, a stubbornness that shouldn't be underestimated. There are signs of life. The tech scene in Paris, Station F, is growing. There's a generation of young French people who are tired of the old dogmas, who want to build, innovate, and take risks. They're fighting against the gravity of the system, but the math is relentless. The debt is real, the aging is real, the brain drain is real, the poverty of the middle class is real. France is living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The illusion of wealth is maintained by debt. And the social peace is maintained by spending money the state doesn't have. The question isn't if the correction is coming, the question is when. And when it does, it won't just be a French problem. Because France is the canary in the coal mine for every Western democracy. It is showing you, in real time, what happens when an aging population meets unsustainable debt. When a welfare state runs out of workers to fund it. When a country that once made things decides to just sell the memory of when it did. Look at the symptoms: aging population. France hit the wall first, but the US is 10 years behind. De-industrialization. France gutted its factories faster, but the American Rust Belt is telling the same story. Debt addiction. France's 114% debt to GDP is shocking, but the US is racing to catch up. Running trillion-dollar deficits in peacetime. Political polarization. The collapse of the center in France, socialists and Republicans basically dead. And the rise of the extremes is a preview of what's tearing apart the US and UK right now. France is the laboratory. It's trying to maintain a 20th century standard of living. With 21st century demographics and 19th century economic thinking. If France collapses, if the bond markets finally lose faith, if the EU has to bail out the second largest economy in Europe, it won't just be a French problem, it will be a global financial cataclysm. It will be 2008, but with better wine and angrier rioters. So when you look at France, don't just see a poor country in denial, see a warning flare. See a preview of what's coming for everyone else. And ask yourself this question: if France, with all its advantages, its education system, its infrastructure, its nuclear power, its luxury brands, if France can't make the math work, what chance does anyone else have? That's the real lesson here. France isn't an outlier, it's the future, and the future is poorer than you think.